This is Land of Havilah, Mark 1b. After Peter, Andrew, James, and John left everything and followed Jesus, verse 21, they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath day he entered into the synagogue and taught. They were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as having authority, and not as the scribes. Immediately there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, Ha! What do we have to do with you, Jesus, you Nazarene? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Jesus rebuked him, saying, Be quiet, and come out of him. The unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, saying, What is this? A new teaching? For with authority he commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. The report of him went out immediately everywhere into all the region of Galilee and its surrounding area. Comment. In verse 21, Jesus and his disciples went to the synagogue at Capernaum on the Sabbath day. Capernaum was on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. As Jesus was teaching, or immediately after he finished, in verse 23 there was a man in the audience with an unclean spirit. The Greek behind unclean spirit is exactly what it says in English. It's akathartos, which is unclean, and pneuma, which is spirit. The term appears 22 times in the World English Bible New Testament. Unclean spirit's probably the same as another Greek term, demonizomai, which appears about 91 times and is translated demon. We can gather from those descriptions that unclean spirits or demons sometimes inhabit people. A demon may cause illness, changes in behavior, influence the thinking, or even completely take over a person's speech or action. They might have originated as angels which were corrupted, Revelation 12:4 and 12:9. In Ephesians 6:12, quote, Our wrestling is not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities, against the powers, against the world's rulers of the darkness of this age, and against the spiritual forces of wickedness in heavenly places, end quote. So there do exist spiritual forces of wickedness and darkness, not made of flesh and blood, that cast their influence wherever they can in this world by inhabiting and influencing men, to the point of ruling or having their way in the affairs of men. And our struggle in the Christian life is against them, not so much against the men they influence, not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of darkness, which are sometimes behind men's thinking and behavior, including behind our own. Quoting again, Our war is not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of wickedness in heavenly places, end quote. Someone said, and it sounds about right, that of Jesus' recorded works, he spent about a third of his time casting out demons, or unclean spirits. In verse 24, we have an example that a demon was opposing Jesus' teaching in the synagogue. He spoke through the man, twisting Jesus' message, saying that Jesus came to destroy. Quote, Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. End quote. There was a grain of truth in it that God had a history of destroying men when they were irredeemably evil, as he did at Sodom and Gomorrah and in the flood of Noah, and it was true that God would destroy evil men again in the end, 2 Peter 2:12. But that grain of truth spoken by the demon was a distraction from the business at hand, that Jesus came not to destroy but to save. It's the forces of darkness that are intent on destruction. As Jesus said, speaking of Satan, quote, The thief only comes to steal, kill, and destroy. I came that they may have life and may have it abundantly, John 10:10. And Jesus said, quote, For the Son of Man didn't come to destroy men's lives, but to save them, Luke 9:54. Whenever God destroys, it's a good thing because he destroys evil. But the unclean spirit in the synagogue simply said, Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Trying to cast shade on Jesus' mission and on God, trying to equate holiness with destruction, to paint Jesus as someone who shouldn't be welcomed, calling light darkness and darkness light. In verse 25, Jesus wasn't having it. He commanded the demon to be quiet and to leave the man. It came out visibly and audibly by convulsing the man and making him cry out. In verse 27, nobody had seen anything like it, and in verse 28, news of it spread into all Galilee and the surrounding area. Coming up after Jesus and his disciples attended the synagogue, verse 29. Immediately when they had come out of the synagogue, they came into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's wife's mother lay sick with a fever, and immediately they told him about her. He came and took her by the hand and raised her up. The fever left her, and she served them. Comment: Jesus and his disciples went to Peter and Andrew's house after synagogue, and Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law. She must have been more than a little sick, because Luke 4:38 says it was, quote, a great fever, and they begged him for her, end quote. About this same time, Matthew 4:13 says Jesus stopped living in Nazareth, and if we could say he had a home at all, it was in Capernaum, quote. Leaving Nazareth, he came and lived in Capernaum, end quote. We don't know much about his living arrangements except that it was in a house, Matthew 9:28. He might have lived in the same house of the verses we just read, Peter and Andrew's house, with Peter's mother-in-law and Peter's wife. Coming up still on the same day after Jesus cast out the unclean spirit in the synagogue, and the news spread into the surrounding area, as it said in verse 28, it didn't take any time at all until those hearing the news started coming. At evening, when the sun had set, they brought to him all who were sick and those who were possessed by demons. All the city was gathered together at the door. He healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons. He didn't allow the demons to speak because they knew him. Comment: in verse 34, there was something else we can learn about demons. Jesus didn't allow them to speak because they knew him. So even though men didn't recognize who Jesus was, other than being a miracle worker and someone who taught with authority, the demons did. The demon in the synagogue knew he was the Holy One of God, and in verse 34, the demons also, quote, knew him. Jesus didn't allow them to speak because they would have perverted the message, and they had information about his identity that he wasn't ready to divulge. Quote, he didn't allow the demons to speak because they knew him. Verse 35. Early in the morning, while it was still dark, he rose up and went out and departed into a deserted place and prayed there. Simon and those who were with him followed after him, and they found him and told him, everyone is looking for you. He said to them, let's go elsewhere into the next towns, that I may preach there also, because I came out for this reason. He went into their synagogues throughout all Galilee, preaching and casting out demons. Comment: after performing those first public miracles, Jesus will never have another moment alone unless he slips off. In verse 35, he got up while it was still dark and went to a deserted place to pray. In verse 39, he started touring Galilee with his disciples. While on tour, he ran into someone that heard about him. Verse 40. A leper came to him, begging him, kneeling down to him, and saying to him, if you want to, you can make me clean. Being moved with compassion, he stretched out his hand and touched him, and said to him, I want to. Be made clean. When he had said this, immediately the leprosy departed from him, and he was made clean. He strictly warned him, and immediately sent him out, and said to him, see you say nothing to anybody, but go show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing the things which Moses commanded for a testimony to them. But he went out and began to proclaim it much and to spread about the matter, so that Jesus could no more openly enter into a city, but was outside in desert places, and they came to him from everywhere. Comment: the life of a leper was a nightmare. By the law of Moses, lepers had to isolate themselves, wear torn clothes, and cry out, unclean, unclean, anytime someone approached. Leviticus 13:45 and 46. Therefore, there was little they could do to make a living or make a life. They were literally untouchable. But in verse 41, Jesus, quote, stretched out his hand and touched him, end quote, and healed him. In verse 44, Jesus told him to go show himself to the priest, which is what a leper was supposed to do if he was healed, according to the law of Moses. The priest had to examine him, and if he was well, the priest gave him permission to re-enter society, Leviticus 13:13. In verses 44 and 45, Jesus told the leper to keep quiet about the healing, But the leper, quote, spread about the matter, end quote, so much that Jesus was mobbed from that point on, so that he couldn't openly enter a city, but stayed outdoors in deserted places. But still, quote, they came to him from everywhere, end quote. Jesus will still enter towns and cities, but it's going to be difficult. Mark 2's next at landofhavilah.net. Mark 2.